Ruth and I have three grown daughters, so it's been a few years since we've been married over 31 now. When I asked the genie for a house full of women, 3 daughters and a wife really wasn't what I had in mind. So sometimes you have to be careful what you ask for. Dakota Lakes is located east of Pierce, South Dakota, but the landscape is very, very similar to southeastern Alberta. It's almost scary looking at the landscape at our farm versus what it is here. It's a mixed grass prairie type situation. So a lot of what we say has a lot of applicability here for the dry land things, plus we do have irrigated stuff. A few years ago, Ruth and I had the opportunity to go to France and travel around, and they gave us a car that had a English-speaking GPS on it, and we would do a meeting in the morning, and we found out after the first day we couldn't stay for lunch because that lasted too long. For the noon meal, it took 2.5 hours, and we didn't get to the next town. But we'd travel to the next town, meet some farmers there for evening meal, and then do 8 to noon, and then take off again. And one of the things they always did is took us to a castle. Every town has a castle, and you'd look at the castle, and boy, that's great, and this is where they stored the grain. And then I'd ask them, well, where'd you grow the crops that went into the granaries? Well, on the land around the castle. Well, the land around the castle was so degraded it didn't grow anything anymore. And when I pointed that out, it kind of surprised them a little bit to think that way. But that's what their soils look like in France. And the French and the Germans and the British and whatever left Europe and came to the Western Hemisphere because they degraded the soil so badly in Europe that they had to go elsewhere to find opportunity. One of the examples of that in 1742, the Lavandre brothers came from Winnipeg, crossed the Continental Divide in North Dakota or in southern Manitoba, there is one there, and then they came down the Missouri River and buried a lead plate right above Fort Pierce, South Dakota, claiming that area for France. And the area that we live in is part of the Louisiana Purchase, which was purchased from France in 1804. And so when they did that because they had degraded the soil so badly in the eastern part of the United States that they knew they had to move west. And George Washington, our first president, and Thomas Jefferson, our third president, who bought the Louisiana Purchase, had been discussing this need to do a better job of taking care of the land, or they'd have to move west in order to find new land. So that process of going and finding new land continued. And Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri River in 1804. Those guys were tough. They came up the river pulling a boat, and with nobody to supply them, they had to get their own supplies and that kind of thing. All the way from St. Louis to north of Bismarck, North Dakota, and then the second year they went west to the west coast. And when they came back, actually, Lewis came up the Milk River quite a ways. So took a little side trip. Well, what were they looking for? They were looking for new land to settle because they were degrading the land in the east, and they were also looking for furs and those kind of things. The beaver, your national emblem. And they wanted to kill them and make hats out of them. And they took millions of beavers out of the central part of the United States, and I'm sure in Canada the same thing happened, and all the little beaver dams that were keeping the water in the draws and on the landscape were gone. And then the settlers came, and they cut down the trees in the draws, with few trees there were, because we, like you, don't have very many trees on our prairie parts. And they started to do tillage, and they overgrazed. And so we had a huge amount of flooding taking place in the Missouri River system. So what's the solution? Do you put the beaver back? No, we build big concrete dams. It's a very European male thing to do. So we had the Pick Sloan project, which put 4 reservoirs in South Dakota, 1 in North Dakota, and 1 in Montana to control the water level, stop the flooding down river in St. Louis and New Orleans and those kind of things. And in return, we were supposed to get 500,000 acres of irrigation, but it was gravity irrigation. And they were going to take the water 120 miles. It didn't make any sense what they were planning. Here's a photo of the dam. A few years ago, that thing is silting in so bad that it almost overtopped when we had a really wet spring. And they had to release a bunch of water and flooded the city anyway. Supposed to not have that happen. That little building on the edge of the power plant there is the place they were supposed to put the irrigation pumps. When somebody invented a center pivot, the farmers along the reservoirs decided, well, if they weren't going to build that project to the east, maybe we should irrigate ourselves. So they built these pipelines, the personal pipelines up out of the reservoirs to irrigate land. And this is in the 70s when prices were high, similar to a couple of years ago. Prices were high, interest rates were low, energy costs at that time were low. What could you lose? So there's one of those pivots. They use the high pressure machines to try to minimize how fast you put the water on. Big pressure put the water on more slowly than low pressure. But what happened is, because of their management practices, lots of tillage, those kind of things, the water just ran off and went back to the river. And this is about the time we entered the picture, because we were working on nitrogen fertility under irrigation, and then realized that we needed to work with making water go in the ground. And the irrigation farmers in that area at that time got together and decided to start a research farm, because the university wasn't going to be able, didn't have the resources to do it. And in fact, I encouraged them not to let the university do it on their own, to have farmer involvement. So the Dakota Lakes Research Farm is actually a not-for-profit corporation owned by farmers. Got about 500 owners. And they have a board of directors that works with me. In the beginning, all 11 of them were irrigators, and all 11 were conventional till. But by the time we got to building the farm, I said, I think I would like to do it all no-till because of the savings. The water savings and those kind of things, and equipment savings as we built the farm. If I could do it no-till, we could be cheaper. And I remember the president of the board, after a long discussion, he just summed it up and he says, I know how to farm with tillage. I don't know how to no-till. It's no-till the damn thing. So we've been 100% no-till since the farm was created in 1990. The concept was the 1980s. If we look at the central part of South Dakota, the central, north central, and south central crop reporting districts that used to be all wheat and summer fallow or continuous cereals in the east. The only corn that was grown was under irrigation, and there's just a little bit of that. If we compare them in 1986 versus 2014, they now produce $1.6 billion more crop than they did in 1986 if we use the same price. Almost all of the irrigated land has been converted back to dry land because the irrigation was too expensive. High lifts, a lot of guys are pumping 300 to 400 feet. But the things that we did at Dakota Lakes, which we're going to talk about, was achieved not because we set out and said we're going to incrementally make wheat yields better, or we're going to make summer fallow better or more efficient or whatever. What we did is we looked at the whole ecosystem and said this thing is broken because we have saline seeps, we have roads being closed because of blowing dust. We have something really wrong with how we're managing the ecosystem. And I think part of that comes from the fact that I was trained as a chemist, not as an agronomist, to look more at systems thing. So we decided we wanted to better manage the ecosystem and see then what we could do in terms of production. I call this a transitional change or transformational change or systems approach or holistic approach. That's kind of some of the names you see. You see the name regenerative a lot as well now with people that follow us. A lot of people know Gabe Brown, and everybody goes, oh boy, Gabe Brown. Do you know Gabe Brown? And I always say when I met Gabe Brown, he was a conventional tiller. And they came to the farm along with Jay Fuhrer, and I made fun of Jay Fuhrer all day because he built terraces. So, and those guys have just done a wonderful job of getting into the concept and bringing it forward. I stole this from Jay Fuhrer, and he said he stole it from somebody else, but the light bulb was not the result of incrementally improving candles. That's that brain transplant that Brian was talking about, and that comes from one of my farmers, the guy who said, let's no-till it. When somebody says, oh, I want to be a no-tiller and whatever and come to Ralph, he said, well, go down to Dakota Lakes and get your brain transplant first. So you start thinking about things differently rather than looking at how we used to do it and trying to change that, just totally take a different tack and go from there. A farmer manages ecosystems and takes sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide and makes them into products to be sold. I could just let Brian do this talk, by the way. Ecosystem processes. How is your water cycle compared to what it was when it was a native system? How about the energy flow? How much sunlight did it capture? Mineral cycle. What are you doing with your nutrients? And then the community dynamics or diversity. Does the rain feed plants and recharge the groundwater, or does it run off or deep percolate or cause erosion or water quality concerns? In the Corn Belt of the United States, they put a lot of drain tile because they have a broken water cycle, and they put in drain tile to get rid of their water, but they also get rid of a lot of nutrients. They go to the Gulf of Mexico and cause hypoxic zones. We're just not going to be able to do that forever. I think the writing's on the wall. So back to the water cycle, the water running off. We now can put on 2 inches of water in 9 minutes with no runoff. And one of the things we do with visitors who come in the summer, if you come in the summer, we'll do it with you, is we walk behind those irrigators after they've applied 2 inches of water, and you will not get your feet muddy. You will not sink into the ground because the water goes into the soil like it would in a native system through macropore flow. And it really surprises people when they see that. And it's going in macropores. We always have our armor, what we call the armor, or Jay Fuhrer's armor, that surface residue is always there. You do not see bare soil. If you go into native systems, you don't see bare soil unless you've had a fire or a flood or something like that. So there I have a pin stuck in one of our macropores. For this crowd that has a lot of irrigation in the community, there's an irrigation wheel track that hasn't been closed in 20 years. That's as deep as it gets. So if that doesn't shake you a little bit, if you're an irrigation person, that if a bunch of irrigators come from California or someplace, first thing we do is show them a wheel track. Because the water's going to the ground, it's not there causing you to do ruts. If you do tillage and you go out too early in the spring, you will sink in as deep as you've done tillage. And most people's response to that is to do tillage deeper. And somebody was showing stuff stuck yesterday. You know, that just doesn't happen. The water goes in the soil. Take the E out of ET. As irrigators, you know the term evapotranspiration, ET. Evaporation makes you no money. Transpiration, water going through a plant, makes you money. Irrigated or dryland guy. Maximize the water use efficiency in the late summer by having that residue on the soil, because that's when you need it. Make the water enter the soil and not run off. Maximize the water holding capacity of the soil, and I'll show you a slide in a bit that talks about how much adding organic matter increases water holding capacity of this soil. Well, this is a good idea for irrigation. This is where we started. It's a great idea for those without irrigation. If an irrigator screws up and runs some water off, he can pump some more if he has enough time and he has enough money. If a dryland guy screws up and runs a bunch of water off, it's permanently gone. I used to make a lot of fun of people who did tillage because the snow would blow in the ditch. And I always said they valued their ditch hay more than their crop. Or you have farmers come in after a big rain and say, boy, that was a good rain, the ditches are full of water. Why is he happy? It shouldn't be in the ditch. It needs to be in the soil. Most of the irrigators, like I said, have now turned to dryland people. Ecosystems harvest sunlight and energy to drive all their processes. If we remove the products from the ecosystem, it reduces the energy available for your microbes. So if you want to have healthy soils and lots of microbiology, you need to leave them something to eat. If you harvest the canola and bale the straw, or harvest the lentils and bale the straw, you haven't left them nothing, even if you're doing rotations that are really low in residue. Somebody the other day said, well, his rotation was durum, mustard, and lentils. Well, there's nothing there to eat. You're not going to have a lot of activity there. The native vegetation here is 90-some% high residue grasses. Our cropping systems need to be better than at least 80%. Constant, is the energy used constant or finite? Is it benign or potentially damaging? Is it internal or external? With sunlight, if you own land or rent land, the sunlight that falls on that land is yours for free. And it's benign. That's wonderful energy. Other than if you're white-skinned Caucasians like most of us are, we have a little propensity to get skin cancer if we don't cover up. But other than that, the sunlight's pretty benign. Fossil fuels are potentially damaging both in their production and their use. And people keep talking more and more about that, and I won't get into that argument. But it's finite. We're going to run out. I know it doesn't seem like you are, but eventually we're going to run out of fossil fuels. I don't understand why North Dakota and maybe even Alberta are so anxious to get their oil all used up. They want to do it all right now. I'm not sure why, because it's not going to go anywhere. If we leave it there for a while and extract it more slowly, it could be valuable for a long period of time. But that's a political argument, not mine. Internal or external, again, that sunlight is internal. You don't have to buy that. Fossil fuels you have to buy. Mineral cycle, are the nutrients available for plant use and environmental services, or have they been leached, eroded, or transported from the landscape, sent to China, well, not China anymore, or the ocean? At least in the United States, not China anymore. You know, that he does good things. He just doesn't know why he's doing them, see? Serendipity. Somebody does something and you end up in a good place even though you didn't intend to go there. Ecosystems that leak nutrients turn into deserts. Desertification, there's a whole branch of science that studies that. The cause is always loss of nutrients, especially organic matter. A 120-car train of soybeans or canola contains 400,000 pounds of phosphate. If it goes to China, if that material, that canola gets crushed in China, it goes to China, the phosphorus isn't coming back. The nutrients aren't coming back. If you cycle it on your place using livestock, it's there. Saline seeps. When college students come to my place, Vo-Tech or college students, and we're showing them around, I always ask them what's in a saline seep. And if they say salt, they get in trouble with me. And the guy that's really in trouble, or the lady that's in trouble, is the instructor. What's in a saline seep is fertilizer. Go sample your saline seeps and have them tested. There's lime, there's gypsum, there's lots of nitrates in most saline seeps, and chlorides, which are essential elements. Some of your soils around here may have sodium, but most of them, the predominant elements there are lime and gypsum and those kind of fertilizers. And they just have gone to the wrong place because the water and mineral cycle has been broken. You haven't cycled it properly. We want to put something out there to catch those nutrients before they go deep. So there's a warm season grass cover crop growing after wheat harvest. Wheat harvest, stripper-headed wheat stubble with nothing on the left and the cover crop on the right. And there's some more cover crops. We do a thing with alfalfa where we grow alfalfa and corn in the same field at the same time in a pattern. So it's like a perennial cover crop. And it's just a way of trying to balance the cycle. There's the alfalfa before we plant the corn. The alfalfa will stay there and be suppressed a little bit and then allowed to come back. Now this is under irrigation, but we have the deep root system in there to cycle these nutrients back to the surface so they don't become a saline seed. We've done a lot of work with trying to plant cover crops with coatings. There's some flax coming up after sunflower harvest that was planted with an airplane before we harvested. That's not been a really consistent thing. But we call this catch and release nutrients. You're trying to balance that water and nutrient cycle, not let it get away, not let it get into a drain tile. Fertilizer management, my PhD is actually in soil fertility. It's pretty easy in no-till if you cycle things. We put some starter with or in proximity to the seed. Other nutrients are placed near the row at seeding or on the soil surface after crop canopy. If we broadcast fertilizer before or at seeding, it encourages weeds and it causes drop in pH. If you've got pHs dropping, it's a symptom that you're not cycling things well. We need to have available nutrient, moisture, and roots all in the same place, same time. It's pretty simple. If you have lots of mycorrhizae because you're a long-term no-tiller and you do good rotations, you have a massive root system, so you can run fairly low available nutrients and get by. Weeds and diseases are nature's way of adding diversity to a system which lacks diversity. I listened to several talks yesterday that talked about weed and disease problems. Every one of those is rotation dependent. And we have the same problem in the Corn Belt where they do corn soybeans every other year. We had the same problem when we did wheat fallow. When we put diversity out there, then all of a sudden our weeds kind of disappeared. It's not that we don't use herbicides, we do, but we don't have to use nearly as many as the guys that do low diversity rotations. And the other thing is disturbance. So very low disturbance, you can't tell that we've seeded hoe drills will cause weeds because they stir things up. And we've got data to prove all this. So if you don't believe me, send me an email and I'll send you all the data. It's kind of interesting. Some of it's actually Canadian data. Mother Nature is an opportunist. Not that other word that people use. If you have a problem, you provide the opportunity. So when you run into a problem, the first thing you should do, instead of calling somebody and say, how do I kill this weed or how do I kill this disease, start looking through what you've done and decide where you have provided the opportunity. Get to know your enemy. Know that species a little bit. Know its habits and say, where did I give it a chance? Because normally you can take that away and not have to get too involved. Does the action address the weakest point in the life cycle of the organism? When do we spray our weeds? After they're up. Right? Well, they're not weak anymore. Think of your crop. Once you get it up this big, you feel pretty good about it. And the weeds feel the same way. They're hard to kill. The best time to go after it is to keep it from forming a seed or to go after it before it germinates. Weed resistance. I took this photo in the early 1990s. 6 ounces of pursuit on chickpeas. You can see there's chickpeas hiding in there amongst the kochia someplace. That was as a result of me making the remark when they came out with pursuit-tolerant corns. I said to farmers, don't do pursuit on both corn and your soybeans because you're going to get resistance to pursuit. Kochia or other weed will become resistant to pursuit and you'll lose it. And not only will it be resistant to pursuit, that weed will probably be resistant to other ALS herbicides. I was threatened with a lawsuit. And in response to that threat, I said, if I don't have resistant weeds in 3 years at the Dakota Lakes Research Farm, I will retract. It only took me 2. I put in a trial, went up to the neighbors, got some of his glean-resistant kochia. shook some seeds over top of my plots, and we had pursuit-resistant kochia. I mean, this is really not hard. When all these genetic people come up with all this stuff they're doing, we heard about a bunch of it again yesterday, and they bring it up, like little children. Oh, look what I've developed here. And Mother Nature looks down and says, you damn amateur. I've been doing this for billions of years. Let me show you how this is done. Nature's efforts to add diversity can be countered by adding beneficial diversity to the system. If you go up into the mountains, you don't have weeds growing everywhere because you have diversity. You might have a few, but you don't have any one species taking over. We have not had to apply a broadcast insecticide at Dakota Lakes for over 16 years because of our diversity and because of our predator population. The number one predator for aphids are fungi. The thing that kills the most aphids are fungus species. Number two is something like a ladybird beetle that'll eat 100 aphids in a day. Okay? So what do they tell you to do if you go and say, well, it's time to spray some herbicide? The consultant will say, well, why don't you put some insecticide and some fungicide in there at the same time? It's only a few bucks. What have you just done? You've killed all your predators. Okay? You need to think about, like Brian said, the process. No-till is not about lack of tillage, about managing soil, water, soil structure, soil biology, and carbon compounds in the soil. And frankly, just between you and me, you cannot control an ecosystem if you do tillage. It's just a massive destruction that goes on out there, and then everything goes all kinds of different directions, and you have no management of it. Strive to produce a crop which is healthy, not a crop that does not get sick. I don't see anybody sick in this room. There's nobody with an oxygen bottle or a mask or anything like that, or an IV. But there's difference in health amongst us, and we all went out and got on bicycles and went for a 40-mile ride. Some of us would do better than others. What you want is a crop that's going to be healthy, so when it gets pushed a little bit, it just is fine, thanks. In other words, you got to look at this big complex system of all these different factors and try to balance those. And once you take tillage out, unless you change other things, you really collapse that wheel. I can make this more simple by putting it in categories called cultural practices, technology, and management. What many people have done is they've tried to change their system and do less tillage, is they try to replace what tillage was doing with technology. Well, there is simply not enough technology available to do it, as evidenced by resistant this and resistant that. Even if that technology were available, it's probably going to be so expensive we can't really afford it. And if we could afford it, as we heard yesterday, you can't really sell that to the consumer. Okay, so what we have to do is take out tillage, which is a cultural practice, and replace it with other cultural practices like rotation, sanitation, and competition. Sanitation meaning not bringing in seeds and those kind of things of weeds. Keep them from getting onto your ground. Okay? Rotation is huge. But in nature, tillage is a catastrophic event. It's a fire or a flood or a volcano or something, an earthquake, but it doesn't happen in natural systems. Tillage is to agriculture what fracking is to petroleum. Both of these processes increase the speed and extent of removal of compounds from the ecosystem. Well, with oil, that's fine because it's going to be gone anyway. But with soil, we need to have it around. This should scare you. What we're doing, yesterday the speaker talked about people who try to scare you. Eroding and degrading the soil is a scary thing. You should be scared that that is going on. That should be the scariest thing that you discuss. If you could know only the one thing about a soil, what would you want to know? Organic matter. As organic matter increases from 1 to 3%, the available water holding capacity doubles. If we get to 4%, it's more than half. It's huge, okay? Short-term studies are not accurate in evaluating treatments such as tillage rotations that have long-term impacts. We need to have government involved so we can have these long-term studies, or we need to have organizations like Dakota Lakes. Crop rotation lies time. We're controlling it with time for natural enemies to destroy the pathogens of one crop while unrelated crops are growing. Proper intensity, adequate diversity, stable, sustainable profitability. Native vegetation is the best indicator of the range of intensities which are appropriate for a location. So we're similar to you. Our intensities are going to be similar to yours in terms of dry land rotation. Most of plant growth problems blamed on no-till are the result of inadequate diversity or improper intensity. Put water saved by no-till to work. More high water use crops, and this is where the cover crops or double crops come in. This is a very old slide. We've been saying this forever. We do very little cover cropping on our dry land because we don't have the moisture to do it. There's a few places we do, and there's instances when we have a year that's wetter than normal that we do, but it's not a normal practice. We have cover crops and forage crops on all of our irrigated ground. At least 3 crop types. And no, durum and wheat are not different crop types. I had a guy tell me one day, well, what's your rotation? He said, well, I do durum and I do hard red spring and I do, and I'm going, well, no, those are both weeds. Okay, 3 crop types. We like to see at least warm season grass and a cool season grass in there and 1 broadleaf. I show this slide because people think about weeds. There's a wheat field of mine where I was using auto steer. Ought to steer better than that. And I came in a little wide. Everybody does that once in a while, and we put no herbicides usually on our winter weeds. And there's no weeds there because we have a matter residue and we have low disturbance and we have good rotations. You know, weed, to us, herbicides are just something to keep a plant, a weed, suppressed until my crop can take over, or something that we use to keep the weed from going to seed, but it's not to control the weed. But the biggest thing is what kind of rotation you have is how much organic material do you have there. Here's a photo in a very dry year, 2006, of a wheat field, that the year before that wheat field was peas, the year before the peas was corn. And the year before the corn was soybeans. Okay, so it's a soybean, corn, pea, wheat sequence. Very dry year, looks like that. Here's a picture of a wheat field that the year before the wheat was peas, the year before the peas was corn. That field is 500 feet from the other field. What's going on there? Well, this one didn't have the soybeans in there. In other words, we had a pea wheat, a corn pea winter wheat, and then a soybean corn pea winter wheat. Half broadleaves versus 2/3 grasses, higher residue. That had been going for 16 years. And we started seeing these huge differences actually at about 10 years in terms of those 2 rotations. If I look at the data, in 2006, where I had the low residue rotation versus the high residue rotation, we had 7.9 inches of rain from the time, or total precip from the time we harvested the peas until we harvested the winter wheat. We got 60 bushel on the high residue rotation, 29 on the low. In 2005, 92 versus 57 when we had a above normal rainfall year, 23.7. And in 2002, 56 versus 28 on 6.4 inches of rain from the time we harvested the peas until. So people say I can't do high residue rotations because I make money on my low residue crops. But if you're mining in the process and degrading your soil so they're not as productive, then that's not the right answer. Here's 2016. You see the same pattern, but not as bad. 95 versus 80 versus 60 versus 95 versus 87 on different things going on, but those high residue rotations are in the 95s, 90, 95s, and the other ones drop down into the 60s or 80s. As citizens of Canada, you need to decide what you would like agriculture to look like in the future. Our present path is troubling if what you're doing is producing everything to go outside of Canada. The Europeans came to Canada and the United States to extract the wealth and take it back to Europe. We're still sending them the stuff, right? So maybe when you start looking for your future, don't look for next week, start looking a little further down the road. Use 200 years as timeline. Dakota Lakes, we use 600 years. Native American culture makes decisions on 7 generations, which would be 280 years. What do you want southern Alberta to look like 280 years? Southern Alberta is one of my favorite places to visit. Makes me feel at home, and I have lots of friends here. Never in history has all of mankind knowingly faced this impending catastrophe. Something's going to happen here. We're changing the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Something's going to change. And we can do something about it, but we need to decide what. That research that we do needs to be transformational, not incremental. This stuff that we waste a lot of money on trying to control a resistant weed that we shouldn't even have. What we should do is be focusing on making systems where we don't develop the resistance. 80% of the total input cost in agriculture can be traced directly to energy at this time. 1970, the average wheat price was $1.37 a bushel, and the average price of barrel oil was $3.39. What's that ratio today? You're using oil whose price is going up to produce wheat whose price is not going up as fast. There's something wrong with our model. It takes the energy of 1 gallon of diesel fuel to manufacture, transport, and 5 pounds of N. That means if you put on 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you're putting on 30 gallons of diesel fuel. That should scare you. Fossil fuel input in agriculture was 120 years ago was essentially zero. In 120 years from now, probably less, it'll have to be zero again. Have you started to figure out what the hell you're going to do? Right? Dakota Lakes Research Farm will be fossil fuel neutral by 2026. In other words, we will produce as much oil as we use. We have a cold press. I know there's cold presses in southern Alberta. We had the cold press before my brother started to sell them. So if you see some guy trying to sell presses, he's probably related to me. Address the problem instead of treating the symptom. Make sure you're addressing the problem. This is terraces in an irrigated field. The water was still running. The terrace didn't do any good, just kept the water from coming out of the field. I've learned more from observing nature than trying to change it. We always want to change nature. Let's see what she does. She's been managing ecosystems better and for longer than anyone else, and she'd do it fine if we left, which we might. She harvests the maximum amount of sunlight. She leaks very few nutrients, including carbon, from the system. She makes maximum use of water and nutrients because she has these webs of mycorrhizae and those kind of things, and she uses animals, big ones and little ones, as part of the system. And especially here in dry or brittle climates, soil biology slows during times of low soil moisture. The rumen of grazing animals remains moist during continuing these biological processes. And similarly, in cold climates, again, like Alberta and South Dakota, biology slows during times of low soil temperature. The rumen of grazing animals remains warm, continuing biological processes. We have started integrating livestock in our operation because it allows us the ability to cycle nutrients. It allows us the ability to add diversity that you can't do in a lot of places, add diversity that we couldn't add otherwise because we can utilize this stuff. and it keeps our biology going through dry and cold times. So what we have here is oats and barley and peas that were growing after we harvested winter wheat on irrigation. And we swath that, and we learned how to do swath grazing from the Canadians, so you guys know all about this. There's my swath and my orange gloves, and when I show up with my orange gloves, the cows get really excited, because that means the big guy is going to move a fence. That's what that residue looks like even in the middle of the winter, because we have a dry winter just like you do, dry and cold. This wouldn't work so well in Iowa or Illinois. We use our irrigators to move our wires. There's 3 ropes per span hanging down from that irrigator. We tie a electric post fence post to the rope, and then we attach two wires, and there's a little weight on the bottom of the post, and we just move that ahead a bit every day. We fall calve our cows, so you see kind of babies out there with them. We have both lateral moves and pivots, and I have videos. You know, if you really want to see this, I could talk about this all day because it's kind of fun. And they come running when they hear the motors and stuff. But the big thing is we move them on a regular basis. They have access to corn stalks at the same time, so they have the high quality, low quality. But notice after we've grazed, we get 85 to 95% utilization of the forage. And you notice we still have full armor on the ground because of the wheat stubble from the grain crop that we did on that land. We have tur trailers. If you've ever visited, we take people around on these, and we make them into calf shelters by putting that little lean-to thing on there. So in the wintertime, we use it as a calf shelter, and we can move it around. So it's kind of cute. Here's the quality of the stuff. One of them from last year, over 3 tons per acre of biomass at 18.2% protein. Again, we have fall calving cows, so we have to have the high protein there. We cannot produce human edible protein on marginal land without degrading it unless we use ruminant animals. So feeding people is going to require that we use ruminant animals. 40 million cows, or maybe 20 million cows and 40 million goats. Something like that. The world supply of mineable phosphorus will be exhausted in less than 120 years. We're going to have to use perennial sequences or perennial cover crops in order to get the deep nutrients back to the surface. Grazing animals allow us to do that, and they cycle it right in place. Mother Nature does not do tillage unless it's a catastrophic event. She does not export nutrients. All tillage tools destroy soil structure. Hoe drills are tillage tools, by the way. All tillage tools decrease water infiltration. All tillage tools reduce organic matter, and all tillage tools increase weeds. And we have data to support all of that. Bureaucracies, governments, and corporations are operated by people with limited tenure and short-term goals. Think about that. Your legislator is worried about the next election. The people who need to be worried about long-term things are society in general and landowners and farmers in particular. And they need to take control of this agenda. The climate will change. We've changed since Lewis and Clark came through. I've read their journals. By the way, Lewis and Clark stopped at Bismarck, North Dakota, and bought corn from the Indians. And I did a meeting in Bismarck 10 or 15 years ago and talked about corn, and a scientist said we can't grow corn in Bismarck, North Dakota. Stood right up in the meeting, said we can't grow corn in Bismarck, North Dakota, and I just challenged him that the federal government, United States, should have technology at least as good as the Native Americans 2 centuries ago. Okay? Will still be a continental climate. You'll still have cold winters and warm summers versus the coast. Degradation of our ecosystem has a bigger impact on what you see on the land. What we've done to the soil has been more negative than anything that's going to happen with climate change. And we need to reverse that. Farmers and ranchers harvest sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to produce products we can sell. Some of this is humid food. We need to be aware of off-site issues and nutritional issues. If you want to eat beef, maybe we should concentrate on producing beef instead of corn or barley that feeds beef and feedlots. Peak oil is when half the oil is gone. We're past that. Peak phosphorus, we're past that. Peak soil, we're probably past that when half the soil is beyond, is degraded. Take the E out of ET, take the T out of can't, and remember that doing the right thing environmentally is almost always the correct economic approach in the long run. I can take some questions if there's time. You got me off?
Yeah, you're still on. Oh. Thank you, Dwayne. Let's see if we've got some, no, you can't run away right now. I think it takes a little while for a message like that to just sort of sink in, because that's definitely some sober second thought. But if anyone has a question.
We'll be around for a while.
Yeah, he says he will be around today. When we think about that transformational change, or could it happen overnight? Or is it something that takes some patience?
Well, it depends. Trouble is, if you try to transitionally do that incrementally, it's almost impossible. And so when Ralph Holdsworth said, you have to have your brain transplant, you have to start thinking of things differently. And Ralph was one of these guys, when he decided to do it, he just sold all his machinery and bought a no-till drill and had his rotations thought out, and away he went. But we have guys that try to do it transitionally because they have their father in the operation or something, and they really don't want to sell the machinery and because we might need it. And I say, that's okay. I just tell the kid, I said, that's okay. Just take the cultivator or whatever you got, the disc, and you take it out in the trees, and you take off the hydraulic cylinders, and you take off the tires, and you tell Dad and Grandpa that you have to do that to protect him from weather checking and whatever. And then he won't be tempted to put the damn things back on again and go out when you're off on vacation and do some tillage. So.
All right. I hope dads didn't hear that out there. Are there any other questions for Dwayne? It's an amazing opportunity to get to hear you speak. You've kind of become a guru and a legend in this whole world. Are you seeing, especially now, is it gratifying to see the changes that have happened on Dakota Lakes Research Farm? Because now you've had a year or two there to look it over. When you see the results, is that the thing that has impact when people come to visit there? Well, people come to our place, and we also send them to farmers that are doing the same thing, because that's the important part. It's had success beyond our gate. And I'm gratified to see what progress we've made. I'm a bit impatient by why it's taken so long to go further. Okay. All right. Well, let's put our hands together and say thank you very much, Dwayne. It's been a real pleasure to hear your thoughts in person.